Hey, you guys, it's Kim. Welcome back to The Control Variable. So I'm very excited about today's show. It's kind of a dark one, but as you guys know, I like the dark ones. Anyway, it's not just dark. It's also about art and love and how storytelling can help us get through some really hard times. So my guest on today's show is the amazing writer and showrunner Ayelet Waldman. Ayelet's a novelist and a memoirist and an essayist and an activist and the co-creator of the Netflix series Unbelievable and a million other things, but those are the main ones for now. And I wanted to have Ayelet on The Control Variable, selfishly because she's brilliant and hilarious, but also because she spent a lot of her life wrestling with some of our country's deepest problems and finding ways to spin those problems into what they call story gold. So first off, Ayelet's an Israeli immigrant here in America, which is not a fun thing to be since Donald Trump was elected. She grew up in Ridgewood, New Jersey, but she was born in Jerusalem. She spent a year on kibbutz. Judaism is a big part of her identity. She also struggles with mental illness. She was diagnosed with bipolar 2 in her 30s, which comes with a high risk of suicide. You don't want to know how many medications she's been prescribed over the years. But the amazing thing about Ayelet is, somehow, as she's been wrestling with all this stuff, she's also been writing about it really well. She's written essays and a memoir, both about her mental illness. She's written about how she struggled with suicide ideation at times, how she spent decades trying to find the right meds, and why, at a certain point, when all the meds stopped working, she decided to microdose LSD for 30 days. That experience became the subject of her 2018 memoir, A Really Good Day. Did I mention she's funny? She's very funny. So I also wanted to talk to Ayelet because a lot of us in America are struggling with mental illness right now. Johns Hopkins estimates that 1 in 4 Americans are mentally ill. That's almost 70 million people. I'm one of them, as you may have guessed. My brain and I go to war sometimes. It's been like that since I was 10. Up until now, I've been vague when I talk about it on the show, because it's a scary thing to admit, having a mental illness. But I have one. My doctor diagnosed it as clinical depression and anxiety. I take medication for it. I see a therapist. And thanks to those things, my life is actually pretty great. I have a job I love, talking to you guys, a husband, a dog, a house. I pay my parking tickets on time, mostly. I can pass, right? But again, almost 70 million of us here in America are mentally ill right now. And of course, the pandemic is responsible for some of it. But even before COVID, the number was 1 in 5. And that's like 55 million people. That's an epidemic, right? You have to wonder what's going on. So yeah, it's scary to talk about mental illness. But I also think we really need to talk about it. Because we can't deal with this stuff unless we talk about it, right? We can't face the dragons till we look them straight in the eye. And the thing I love about Ayelet is she's really good at looking her dragons in the eye. Like whatever the shame gene is, she don't got it. And you're going to hear all about Ayelet's dragons in a minute. But before we get into the show, there's one more thing I need to mention, which is her very good fortune in the spouse department. As I mentioned earlier, Ayelet's married to the novelist Michael Chabon. And Chabon, it seems, is some kind of magical husband. He splits the housework with her 50-50. He's apparently amazing in bed. And she's written about that too, of course. Ayelet calls him her bashert, which is the old Yiddish word for soulmate. But it's kind of better than soulmate. It's more like destined or intended. They were set up on a blind date back in the 90s. Chabon showed up at the door with a bouquet of irises. By all accounts, it was love at first sight. I knew the second I saw him, Ayelet says. These days, they live together in Berkeley, or LA when they're making TV. They teamed up together in 2019 to make the acclaimed drama Unbelievable, which told the true story of a rape victim who couldn't get the police to believe her story until finally 2 female cops stepped in. Now they're busy adapting The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, Chabon's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, which this podcaster, for one, is extremely excited about. Because as you all know, I'm always thinking about how to create new American stories. And Kavalier and Clay is a truly great American story, one that gives me hope in these dark times of ours. I highly recommend you check it out. So without further ado, here's my talk with Ayelet. One of kind of the big things that we talk about on the show is the story of America and how profoundly broken it is.
You know, I'm not a historian. I don't know that I know much about specifically American history. I've never really felt particularly American. My mom is American and I have an American passport, but I was born in Israel. Both my mom moved to Canada when she was quite young. My father's Canadian. And I've definitely not felt a real connection to this country, even though I've lived here since I was a little girl.
Yeah. So did you feel more like Israeli growing up or more just Jewish?
I felt more displaced. I'm not Israeli because I left when I was a little girl, though I've gone back and forth quite a bit, living for a year here, a year then. I'm not really Canadian because my parents took me out of there, although that's where my family definitely feels like it's from. I have so many family connections in Montreal and no family connections other than my immediate family here. But, I think one of the things about living your life as an immigrant, even of, long term and even with citizenship and all that, is this kind of fundamental sense of displacement. And I think they're immigrants who came here for a better life, who came here out of, who worked really hard to get here. I think they have an attachment to American values that I've always had a certain cynicism about. My dad styled himself a socialist and really despised American values. So I was kind of raised with that attitude.
And how has that ended up sort of residing inside of you in terms of your own values?
Well, it's interesting. When you go to law school in the United States, you learn about the Constitution. It's like, obviously a fundamental structure undergirding everything else you learn about in law school. So I used to have this deep admiration for this flexible document that could grow and change with the needs of contemporary societies changing. There's this notion of the Constitution as this calcified document that has to be interpreted like, Alito interprets it. There's this great tweet. I don't remember it exactly, but right after it was someone who was saying that like all their non-lawyer friends in the wake of Dobbs were saying to them, "Oh my God, is Obergefell next? Is gay marriage next?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure. But also, it's not in the Constitution, women's right to own property."
No kidding, right?
So it was like, the ramifications are so profound if you stop looking at it the way we learned to look at it in law school, which is as a flexible document that can grow and change with the needs of society.
It would be so great if it was a flexible document, right? Because a lot of it's beautiful. The ideals are beautiful. They just need radical updating, right?
Right. I mean, and the individuals who expressed those ideals didn't understand them but it was like they created something much greater than the sum of their parts. But my admiration for that document and my feeling like it was the fact that we had that undergirding our society and our legal system made us somehow better than other countries who worked on a sort of more ad hoc basis has been completely eviscerated. And right now I wish for a constitution-free nation where the law is interpreted as what humanity and citizenship needs rather than Samuel Alito saying, well, there's, no abortion in the Constitution.
Right.
Yeah. Like also there's no right for me to have a credit card independent of my husband's signature. So what are we talking about?
So in terms of the American story, so basically after I did this investigation into the attack on the Capitol and the propaganda around it and kind of the history of propaganda in this country and how it's affected our culture in so many ways, because propaganda on some level has it's basically advertising. I mean, if you look at what propaganda has done to this country, it's kind of warped it in every way you can think of. But specifically, we looked at Nazi propaganda and advertising and a bunch of different aspects of how it had impacted American culture and life right now. And one of the things I came to at the end was just like, we need a new American story, right? Like really blatantly, we need a new American story. And I do have to say that it might be the most foolish romantic idea of all time, but the creative part of me does get really excited about the idea of creating a more capacious and just and humane and just smarter American story. So I think about that a lot. And I of course, ended up thinking about you guys just finishing Kavalier and Clay and wondered how much that was on your minds when you were writing the series. It's a Netflix series, and I know you've just handed it in. And I just wondered kind of how much you were thinking about America and contemporary America while you were writing the scripts?
Well, I think that was certainly an idea that Michael had when he was writing the novel. That notion of illuminating a quintessentially American story was definitely in Michael's thoughts when he wrote the book. And when you think about the superhero comic, of course there were comic books. There were comic books before, and there's this long tradition of illustrated art form. But this idea of the superhero was really born of the American immigrant experience. I mean, Michael always likes to say, and it's so funny to me because it's become this like narrative that everybody says as if it was just invented out of whole cloth. And I really do believe that Michael kind of laid a path for people to think about comics this way. I mean, this is the comic, Superman is like the quintessential Jew, right?
Right,
He comes from afar and believes wholeheartedly in the American experiment and the profound values of America. I can't speak for him, but I am quite confident that that was part of how he envisioned the story he was telling.
If you haven't read The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, I highly recommend that you go out and do so as soon as possible because it is one of the great novels about America ever written. Kavalier and Clay is set before, during, and after World War II in America, and it focuses on two Jewish cousins, one of whom has just escaped Nazi-occupied Prague and unfortunately had to leave his family behind. And the comic book character that they create, the series of comic books that they create called The Escapist, which serves both as protest or in three ways, as protest, escape, and revenge fantasy in the face of the horrors of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And just quick sidebar that the book's sort of big theme is the essential function that art can serve in the face of oppression. So you were saying that it was definitely in Michael's mind when he was writing the book. And then in terms of the series, I was curious about.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, this idea this sort of last sentence that you said, the idea that art can save us, is certainly something we were thinking about when we were writing the show, that we are in these dark, dark times arguably as dark or close to as dark as the times of the Nazis. I mean, we have not seen tens of millions of people killed yet, but we have seen the same callousness towards human life, the same targeting of the other, and we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, nobody anticipated what would happen in Germany. And, Jews were as entrenched, as assimilated, as confident in their identities as Germans, as Hungarians, as Austrians, wherever they were. Of course, you had an identity as a Jew, but for many, if not most Jews in these different countries, your identity as a German Jew, as a German, as a Hungarian was more important. I mean, we have this idea that was created more by photographers, Roman Vishniak, than anybody else, that Jews lived in these little shtetls and were just, wearing their payas and, slinking around from synagogue to farmhouse. And that was not the experience. Jews were an urban,
incredibly educated, successful, artistic.
Exactly. And completely entrenched. I wrote a book called Love and Treasure that really explored the Jewish experience in Hungary. And, there, I don't remember the figures, but it's something like 90% of stockbrokers were Jews, 80% of physicians were Jews. So, I mean, this was an absolutely entrenched community. I mean, when you spoke in Hungary about the middle class, this is pre-World War II, you were really speaking about the Jewish community. I mean, they constituted the bourgeoisie. So I personally, and I think we Jews don't have the same confidence, I think many of us, that just because right now tens of millions of people aren't being murdered, that necessarily means that tens of millions of people aren't going to be murdered. And that kind of wholesale slaughter can happen quickly and without notice. So I don't think that the comparison to Nazi Germany is inapt. I actually think it's apt. And, this notion that we have that as soon as you say Nazi, you've, lost the argument. I think right now, as soon as you say Nazi, you've made a very accurate comparison to what's happening, both in America and around the world.
When I was watching January 6th unfold on TV, I had a total flashback to my high school class on Nazi propaganda and the Holocaust, which my favorite teacher of my whole life, and he was the child of survivors of the Armenian genocide, in which 1.5 million Armenians were murdered. Both his parents were orphaned in it. And so he taught this incredible class about Nazi propaganda and the Holocaust. And he was very, very clear in this class, like, you guys need to know how this works because this could happen again. And literally, like, I mean, I took that class 30 years ago, right? And I was watching January 6th, and all I could think was, oh my God, like, I recognize everything that I am seeing here. This is everything that we were taught in that class. And to be honest with you, like, my husband is German, right? And I mean, he's mostly grew up in America, but he, even when Donald Trump was elected, he said, oh my God, now I understand for the first time really how Hitler actually came to power.
It's interesting because, like, for me, watching that January 6th was horrifying. But for me, the worst part was watching what happened that evening when, despite this hellacious criminal putsch, it's like this attempted putsch, this like lunatic attack on the Capitol, something that had never, ever happened before. The Republican Party went forward with its anti-democratic, utterly dishonest attempt to void a legal election. That's when I thought to myself, oh, we're doomed. Because a bunch of lunatics who believe that there's pedophilia, by the way, like, let's spend a little time, categorizing which political persuasion most pedophiles come from. I'll give you a few minutes. But like, the idea that a bunch of people believe that, there's pedophilia in the basement of a pizza parlor that has no basement does not surprise me. I mean, they're stupid morons.
Okay, but wait, I want to hold on. I have to say one thing there. Ignorance is the core foundational issue that we are dealing with here, ignorance and hatred, right? But I will say, I will lay the disastrous problem of America's public education and its ability to educate its poor at the feet of, I mean, in a lot of ways, of liberal Democrats, because we haven't voted in a way that has ensured that our tax laws will change in order to fund education in a way that is fair across the board, right? We haven't done that.
Sure, but I don't actually know that those people are so poorly educated. Like, I don't know that education would have saved those individuals. I think it's much more likely that they are a product of their families and their context and their racism and their insecurity. I don't know that education saves you from that bigotry and hatred.
But then there's also the evangelicals who all keep their kids home and homeschool them, right? And so
right.
that would have still been a problem, regardless of what you think about education's power.
I do think that what's more terrifying, Josh Hawley is not poorly educated. He's very well educated. And I think that's what scares me more than anything else, that we have a political party so adept at manipulating its ignorant base, and its racist and its insecure and its misogynist base, without any sense of value. I mean, for every Liz Cheney, there are 100,000 Mitch McConnells. And that's where I feel like the end of this society resides. That's why I feel a sense of hope, profound hopelessness.
Even though Michael's an optimist, is he optimistic
about? He's not just an optimist, he's a patriot.
Right, okay.
I'm not.
So you guys just take very different stances on this.
We agree profoundly on the horrors of this and the dangers of this, but he believes in the American experience, American values, much more than I do.
Sure. I mean, I'm remembering a quote of yours, or in an article that came out around 2014 when Love and Treasure came out, where you said, other than being a woman, being Jewish is the most important part of my identity. And I wondered, is that still the case for you?
Yes, for sure. But not in the sense that I'm religious or anything like that. I'm very not. But I think my Jewish identity maybe is based on generational trauma.
Yeah, sure. I know. Yeah.
I think more than anything else.
Yeah. I think that's true for a lot of people, honestly. A lot of Jews, at least, that I know.
And, I don't mean to sound like such a negative person, but I mean, we live in such bleak times. And I do fundamentally believe, like what you were saying about, I don't know that I believe in the power of art to change anything, but I believe that art can be a comfort.
Well, it can be a protest. At the very least, it can be a form of protest and a salve.
Yeah, and there is a point to protest, even if protest is futile. And there is comfort to be had in joint endeavor. And I really believe in that. And I think, art can soothe the misery of those of us who are experiencing this as misery as opposed to joy and this kind of vicious opportunism.
Okay, so here's a question for you. It's sort of slightly tangential, but related. I really, really loved the speech that Michael gave at Hebrew Union College, the commencement speech. And I think, is it called Us, Those People Over There? I loved that speech. And I wondered which is all about, it's a celebration of, he sort of conjures a multi-ethnic, multi-race America that is just beautiful and Whitman-esque. And it's,
he's really talking specifically about the capacity of Judaism to expand and embrace all its multitudinous diversity.
Absolutely. So my question for you was, because I know it was controversial at the time, and I wondered, do you share that vision of that very capacious kind of Judaism, or is it different from?
I think in many ways I introduced Michael to, not necessarily that specific vision. I think that's his own, but I think introducing Michael to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is part of that speech that made people so angry, that's something I did. He grew up in a very traditional American family that wasn't focused at all on Israel, and if it was just as the Holy Land. But because I am Israeli, and because it is more a country than a Holy Land to me, and actually I believe that the sort of notion of Israel as a Holy Land has actually caused much of its corruption. And
that makes sense, because it is almost like makes it into a museum idea or something.
Well, I think it just gives you, I think religious fanaticism, that is what it leads to. I think this notion that if this country is holy to you, then you own it and it belongs to you and you can exclude others. And also read I don't know a lot about the Bible, but it's just it's a long story of people killing one another in the name of God. So when I brought Michael to Israel for the first time, and to be clear, it was funny because he looked at me and he said, "Oh, now I understand you," because there is something about the Israeli character that is familiar if you spend any time with me. But showing him the truth of the Palestinian experience and making it clear the way that I feel like that we as Jews, as Israelis, and also as the international Jewish community have to take responsibility for the profound humanitarian crisis that has existed there for decades, and the genocidal impulses of the Israeli right, and the apathy of so much of the general Israeli community. I can take credit for having introduced him to that. It's complicated, right? Because there are all different kinds of Jews in Israel. There are Ethiopian Jews and there are Moroccan Jews, and they're so Israel is far more multi-ethnic than people give it credit for. However, each of those groups has in turn suffered tremendous discrimination. And the initial founders of our contemporary notion of Israel were all Ashkenazic Jews from Europe, which is not to say they were the first Jews there in contemporary modern history, but absolutely they sort of drove the founding of the state of Israel and the initial waves of Aliyah, which means sort of waves of immigration, and discriminated terribly against the Jews of the Levant, against the Jews who came from countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, and then again in turn against Jews who came from Ethiopia. And that's one of the reasons there's such a focus now in Israel on, they embrace the Jews of Russia so wholeheartedly. And if you see the difference in how they treated them and the Jews of the earlier generations of Sephardic Jews, it's really, it gives you there's a subtlety to that notion of multi-ethnic Israel that I think it's important to understand.
I think I wanted to ask you another question. Just specifically, I was thinking of the word bashert that you used to talk about, Michael. And I just wondered, in Yiddish, that means soulmate, right? And I found that such a moving concept. And I wanted to talk to you about whether that is a word that you would use to describe your relationship.
Yeah, bashert. I don't know that I like it in English.
I know, because soulmate isn't that cool. Soulmate is kind of has a cheesy association in some way, right?
I think it's intended, I would say, more
destined
than soulmate.
Or something. Yeah.
Destined, although I don't even believe in destiny. But yeah, Michael is the person that, to be clear, I don't believe in any of this. I'm not a very spiritual person. I don't believe in higher forces. But there is no doubt in my mind that the second I saw him, I knew that he was the person that I was going to spend my life with. Literally the second I saw him. in the entryway of my apartment in Stuytown carrying a bouquet of bodega irises. And it's been like that from that very moment on, you know?
And he felt the same way, right?
Yeah, it was just this kind of relaxed certainty, which is not to say we haven't experienced, really hard times and tons of conflict, but we've been together for, I think it's actually, when you consider the time we've been dating, we have been together for 30 years or nearly. So there have been rough patches and challenging times, and it has required like a tremendous amount of effort to overcome communication issues, to overcome the fact that I have a mental illness that is really difficult to handle in many ways for a partner. But on the other hand, we love each other like crazy. We enjoy each other's company more than anybody else's. How do you say codependence without its pejorative, implication? So I'm incredibly lucky. And man, I dated a lot of assholes before Michael. I feel more than anything else that it was just the most astonishing piece of luck.
That feeling of destined or feeling of intended, did it have that feeling for a long time? And then sort of only into your marriage, did you sort of hit bigger challenges or?
The feeling of connection, of destiny, of infatuation. I think one of the secrets for us is that continues. So that's been there all along. And then, conflict and challenge has been there all along too. But I would say it's like, 87% joy.
That's amazing. Do you feel like you guys have gotten better at working together over the years? Or, because you really have worked a lot together and you continue to work a lot together. And I just wondered how it had evolved over the years.
We know how to do it, sure. I think that the chances of us doing it again, if Kavalier and Clay doesn't get made, are fairly slim because Michael has novels due, and I am much more interested in continuing to sort of work in television. But I don't know, I don't know what's going to happen. We push and challenge each other when we work together in a way that's very productive. It's painful, but it's productive.
Okay, so it's also sort of like it's business-like, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, but because we are not just business partners, we tend to skip all the things that make working as business partners in a way easier, like the, praise and gentleness. And we're just like, no, that sucks. Let's do something else.
Oh God, that totally makes sense. So out of curiosity, I'm thinking about your 2008. It was 2018 that A Really Good Day came out. Is that right? So I'm in terms of thinking about that, which is Ayelet's amazing memoir about microdosing LSD as a way of exploring its potential to alleviate some of the symptoms of mental illness / premenstrual dysphoria syndrome.
Yeah, PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's just like PMS on steroids.
Right. Do you feel like the diagnosis of bipolar was incorrect?
I think all these diagnoses are useful descriptors, but I think when you have a mood disorder, you are reactive. That's what it means. So you are reactive to circumstance, you are reactive to hormones, you are reactive to whatever's going on in your brain. So I think I don't necessarily reject the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. When I still had a period, PMDD was a more accurate and useful diagnosis. Right now, I'm not sure, if you look at the DSM definition of bipolar disorder, it doesn't apply to me. But on the other hand, I do feel like I have a mood disorder. I take medication for it. I'm much more stable when I'm medicated. But, we have all of these diagnoses, and I really do believe they're just sort of like a useful tool rather than a fundamental truth.
I was wondering if you ever feel like having what is termed as a mental illness is just having a really sensitive nervous system or a really sensitive nervous system's response to living in a sexist, racist patriarchy.
I think it's more than that. Honestly, I think it's like I do think there's like a brain, for lack of a better word, brain chemistry thing. I think, it can make you crazy not technically crazy, but sort of generally crazy to live in a misogynist world and a racist world. But I actually think there's something else going on. I do think there is like a fundamental genetically related.
Absolutely. I know. I agree with you. I mean, I started taking Prozac like when I was 30, right? So 20 years ago, and it had a immediate and remarkable effect on my ability to function as a human being. And I mean, I could always function before, but I really would just have these parts of my life where I really couldn't. I could always have a job. I never lost anything professionally or personally because of it, but it was an intense source of struggle. And for 20 years, that Prozac has worked for me, you know?
Yep. Yeah. Well, that's great. And right now I'm on Lamictal. I always love this, like when we were all like comparing our meds, and Lamictal is working great for me.
Well, I just feel like some of the awesome, super successful, super smart, creative people take medication and rely on medication to function in the world in a way that is, not self-destructive or not harmful. And I feel like, God, we just have to get rid of these stigmas.
Well, that's definitely something I've sort of seen as like one of it is almost like a political commitment to, I feel like for whatever reason, my particular brand of mental illness lends itself to oversharing. But I feel like what that does is give others who are less inclined to overshare a feeling of community, and that their experience, which is alienating fundamentally from the rest of society, that there is someone there who understands. The flip side of that is I actually think this like TikTok based hyper diagnosis, there's this like whole movement like you have ADHD if blah 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 blah, you have anxiety if, and there's this kind of romance attached to mental illness right now you see among the young people, and this desperate diagnoses from people without expertise, so that everybody is like diagnosing themselves because some TikTok influencer told them they have anxiety. I think that's actually really dangerous. So I would sort of say that's like hyper community, but it's just like what happens when the internet completely screws everything up. That's the flip side of it. The sense of feeling like you're not other. But you know what? Maybe I'm just old.
But I wondered, so in terms of your experiment with microdosing, though, have you experimented with it anymore since you finished writing the book?
I experimented with a larger dose, like a full heroic dose of psilocybin, and with a guide, and it was very painful and very uncomfortable, and in many ways it was like horrible, but it was actually very, very useful and profoundly influenced the way I dealt with certain people in my life in a very good way. So that's something I would try again. I also think there's something to be said for sort of moderate doses on a regular basis. I'm probably more inclined to do that than microdosing, sort of like every 3 months, say a 50 microgram LSD experience where you don't necessarily, where you have some psychedelic effects. I think those are useful in terms of their operation on the default mode network. So I think you'd want some of them, but the sort of heroic doses are for me too overwhelming to do on a regular basis. So I think if I did anything, I'd probably do that.
And do you feel like the Lamictal do you feel like you've kind of found your...
Well, for now, like the thing about psychiatric medications is they work for many people for a while and then they don't work. And so, but right now, Lamictal is working great.
Yep. Gotcha. Would you recommend exploring with microdosing for people who have sort of certain kinds of mental illness?
Yeah, sure. There's nothing that can go wrong. Microdosing does not cause any harm to anybody ever, ever, ever. So sure, give it a shot. But I also think that there is something to be said for the more structured, mediated, heroic dosing. I wouldn't recommend that if you have a history of psychosis, certainly. But barring that, I think that's actually the more effective method of impacting your general well-being and emotional health.
I mean, I've heard it described as sort of like a therapy session on giant steroids, like a super
sure.
crystallized, compressed therapy.
I also think MDMA is profoundly helpful. I think it's research shows that it's the most useful treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think it's a really useful tool for couples therapy.
Do you have like an annual ritual where you and Michael go off and do MDMA for a weekend or something?
Yeah, no, it's just we don't only do it once, but we had kids. We went away for the weekend so that we wouldn't be, trying to do anonymity and take care of a baby. 'Cause it's a very specific 6 hour, like talky thing for us. And that's been really useful in terms of maintaining the intimacy and connection and of our marriage and problem solving in the context of love and compassion.
I wanted to just say how much I really appreciated it. Unbelievable. So that was your TV series, which was based on a series of rapes in Washington State and Colorado that took place between 2008 and 2011. It starred Toni Collette and based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning article from 2015 and was a series on Netflix. Basically, it was about a teenager who was charged with lying about having been raped by two male police officers. And I just wondered if you would just say a little bit about how that series came to be and what it was like writing it for you.
Well, I'm a devoted reader of the Marshall Project. I have a background as a public defender, so I read the Marshall Project's reporting every day. Every time I check the website every day. And I saw that was a joint ProPublica Marshall Project. And I saw it, called up a producer that I've worked with before and said, I need this option for me right now.
So you had like a full lightning moment when you read it?
Oh, yeah. As soon as I saw it, I said, this is television. So Michael and I worked on it together. And then.
Did you have to convince him to do it with you, or was he excited?
Oh, no. I took the lead on it, but he was totally happy to work on it with me. And ultimately, a writer, showrunner named Susanna Grant came onto the project and she actually took the lead on it. And I feel like she made a wonderful show. I was part of it till the end, but I think you really have to credit her with the show's success. It was a really exciting thing to be part of, though, because it had such a profound effect on the lives of so many women. And we heard from so many women saying, a version of "I feel seen" and "this happened to me" and "thank you for making this." And it was just to know that you had that kind of effect on someone's life is really, really profoundly satisfying.
It had a similar impact on me, even though I didn't have the exact experience, right? It was just the feeling of being like, okay, here's a woman who's telling the truth and no one's believing her. And finally, she's meeting women who do believe her. And it was just, why hadn't we seen that fucking story before?
It brings to light this notion of how incredibly important it is to acknowledge and believe women's experience. But I actually think it does it with much more subtlety than the contemporary believe all women. I was speaking to one of the police officers, the real women who investigated this case and brought the rapist to justice. And I asked her, I was like, what do you make of this idea, believe all women? Or maybe even I said it, just as my, I just sort of expressed a version of that. And she said, that's not how I operate. She said, the way I operate is I trust and verify. And I thought, oh, that's what it is. You don't just believe everybody, especially if your job isn't to believe everybody, but to get to the truth. But you trust a woman's experience and a woman's expression of her experience. And then if you're a police officer, if you're a prosecutor, you verify.
Yep, you investigate.
And the initial male police officers neither trusted nor verified.
What are you working on now?
Well, we just literally finished Kavalier and Clay scripts on Friday. So give me a break.
Totally.
No, I'm writing a movie it's an adaptation of a novel, and I just got the job, and hopefully the deal will close, and that's what I will do while I wait for Netflix to make its decision.
Okay. Well, that sounds like, congratulations. That's awesome. And I wish you all the best. I'm here
Thank
praying.
you. This was a lovely conversation.
Yeah, it's really good to talk to you. Thank you so much, Ayelet. Take care. So that's Ayelet. She's kind of this incredible paradox, right? Like an unstable superwoman, this triumphant bundle of nerves. And as I was talking to her, I realized something about paradoxes that I'd never thought of before. It's this. Historically, paradoxes have been looked down on, right? Like, oh, she contradicts herself. She makes no sense. But the thing is, a lot of life feels like a paradox to me these days. Pretty much all the time. And I find myself wondering if the mistake we make is trying to pretend life is anything but a paradox. Viewed this way, Ayelet isn't so much crazy as someone who just picks up a lot more than the rest of us. Someone who's just very, very observant. Anyway, here's her advice about how to stay sane in America in 2022. Number 1, talk about it, write about it, find a way to get help. Enough of the shame around mental illness. Mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of. We need each other, and we can't find each other if we don't talk. Second, don't be scared of meds if your doctor wants you to take them. They can really help. Third, I was going to say find a way to get creative, but I don't know if that's always the right advice. I mean, sometimes you just need to lie down, like for a long time. So I can say for myself that at times when I didn't need to lie down for a long time, being creative has been really helpful to me. Other times going for a run has been really helpful. Just getting active, trying to get my body to move. Something to get the feelings out. That has been really helpful for me. I like what Meryl Streep says, take your broken heart and make it art. Okay, that's our show for today, you guys. Thanks so much for being here with me. See you next time. If you or someone you know needs help, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. You can also reach a crisis counselor right now by messaging the crisis text line at 741-741. There is help. Guys, if you like the show, please be sure to go rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. And be honest, okay? Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like, what annoyed the hell out of you, what you want to hear more of. I'll listen. I promise. We're in this together, okay? Let's make something amazing. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Row Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The Control Variable is managed by Sean Madison. Fact-checking by Kelly Stakopoulos. Megan Pettit is our researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the Control Variable train on the tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.